Hello, guys. Good evening. Nice to have you today. So this is one of our uh, event series again for our community. So today we have an interesting speaker, David Okeyode. David, good evening. Nice to have you again.
Hello, sir. Hello. How you doing?
Yeah, it's kind of like I'm hearing a echo.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
know.
just to confirm, can everybody also confirm? Are you having an echo on your hand? If you can confirm in the chat window whether you're hearing an echo. So I'm using my normal microphone, so I think let's check again. Yeah, so the setup looks good. So can people confirm in the
I
chat
think
window?
I think I can't hear it anymore. But
Oh,
David,
okay. Oh, okay.
cool.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So technology.
It's because of the fancy, because it's different sometimes when you have gold in your headset. Sometimes
Yeah,
it's impact.
yeah.
So you have like gold. No, you don't use like all these plastic headsets. You use like the golden one. So sometimes you sometimes you get all these additional sounds. You know,
Yeah.
maybe the sound of Bitcoin. The sound of money. All those type of sounds.
uh, or, or the son of in Nigeria, because I'm streaming from Nigeria.
Oh, I see. So maybe like some network connectivity issues. Who knows?
Yes, yes. Okay, guys. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, Yesterday we couldn't uh, host the event, so we just apologies. So today we have another interesting section from David. So today we have the interesting topic of which me personally would like to learn from. So about logs on AWS. So monitoring, collecting, and processing logs. So as a developer or a cloud engineer, how do you monitor? How do you collect, uh, process, and then monitor log? Or you can also first monitor it and then collect and then process the logs. Yeah. So an analytics. So it could be event logs or other kind of log or metrics. So David will talk us through on that, and which I believe you can learn one or two things. David, it's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks very much, sir. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
So I feel like every time I speak with you, my level goes up. It's like another level all the time. So I'm privileged to be having this conversation. So yeah, it's true. So the people that know they know. So so anyways, so I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen and then we'll get started. So one of the things that actually happened when I was preparing this was I looked at the scale of what needs to be talked about. And in all honesty, I don't think that we're going to be able to look at everything that we need to look at today. However, I think that what we'll do is we'll try to um, have maybe a follow up, or what I'll probably also do is I'll probably share some information um, like on the community publication, so people can refer to that afterwards. So the other thing to also mention is we have a quiz at the end of this session. So just essentially, make sure you're paying attention. There may be some questions that are not from what we're discussing today, but we're going to have a quiz afterwards. And the winner will have the opportunity to win an AWS credit voucher. So for those that won the AWS credit voucher, including yesterday's winner, AWS has sent your voucher codes in. So between now and tomorrow, the the voucher codes are going to be with you. So that's been sent in already. But we're going to have a new winner today. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's get started with this. So let's go ahead and let me get, oh, no, that's not the right one. And I want to go to share my screen. Oh, by the way, I'm just trying to share my, oh, there we go. There it is. So should be sharing my screen now. As I mentioned, while I was preparing this, I looked at the scale of what needs to be covered. I don't think we'll cover everything. So apologies ahead of time. However, we'll see how much we can cover before we get to the quiz. If you do have any questions as we go through the session, make sure you put your question in the chat window, and Sachugo himself, is in the background. You'll be, he can interrupt and essentially bring your question to my notice. So let's get started. So what are we going to be looking at in this particular session? Well, we're going to be looking at a few things. We're going to be looking at monitoring logs and collecting logs, and also processing logs, but I don't think we'll get to the processing section today because of the scale of what we need to cover. So we're going to be looking at services like Amazon CloudWatch and Amazon CloudWatch Logs. We're going to be looking at AWS Config, and we're going to be looking at Amazon MaySee. We're going to be looking at the different logs in terms of Amazon VPC flow logs, S3 access server logs, ELB access logs. So there are a few objectives that we want to achieve by the end of this session. So at least we want to understand how to monitor events and collect logs in AWS and CloudWatch. We want to understand how we can use AWS Config to monitor non-compliant or unsecure resources in our account. We want to understand how to monitor the data that we're storing in S3 buckets for sensitive information using Amazon MaySee. We also want to understand how to identify just native AWS services and that generate logs, and how to collect those logs and how to manage those logs. So we'll talk about processing in another session, I hope. So let's get started. So let's get started by looking at monitoring on AWS. So like many other things that we know about in AWS, monitoring is also a shared responsibility on AWS. What does that mean? What do I mean by monitoring is a shared responsibility on AWS? We are not responsible for monitoring everything. For example, the hypervisors that run in our EC2 instances on AWS, they are not managed by us. Those hypervisors are managed by the AWS data center team, right? Or the AWS team manage those hypervisors. Usually they're using automation to do a lot of the management, but we can't monitor that because it's not our responsibility. We even don't have access to it. So monitoring is a shared responsibility. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is, what are we responsible to monitor, and what does AWS monitor, and how do we get access to the information that AWS monitors? So the thing about this is, we're doing monitoring on premises already. How does that fit into the cloud? So we want to understand, for example, what are the performance indicators for the services that we're hosting on AWS? How do we measure those performance indicators? What are the thresholds that we need to define to show that something is not working correctly, right? And what's the process for responding to that? Sometimes people just focus on collecting all this information, but they don't have a process in place in terms of how do you respond if something has been found to exceed the thresholds that you've defined. Do you have well-defined processes for how you respond to that? So AWS has multiple services that we can use for monitoring and collecting logs. So the first one that we'll have a look at is CloudWatch. So let's have a quick look at this. So what is Amazon CloudWatch? Amazon CloudWatch, it's a web service that we can use to monitor AWS cloud resources. But what sort of monitoring are we talking about? We're talking about visibility into resource usage, right? So what's the visibility into resource usage? We're talking about visibility into things like what's the performance of our AWS resources. We're talking about visibility into maybe just general health of our AWS resources. All those are referred to as metrics in AWS, right? So CloudWatch, what it's going to do is that it's going to automatically collect data from our AWS resources, and it's going to summarize them into using metrics to summarize them, right? But we can also have other logs that we can send to CloudWatch to monitor. So for example, we can have, if we have like an EC2 instance running on AWS, we could install the CloudWatch agent on that EC2 instance and get it to send its logs into CloudWatch, and they'll be stored in a durable fashion in AWS. So it's not just about metrics; it can also be about logs. What else can we do with CloudWatch? Well, we can configure CloudWatch to monitor the incoming logs, and maybe to monitor for things like errors, maybe to monitor for things like anomalies, and then we can raise alerts if certain thresholds are crossed, right? We can raise alerts to notify someone, maybe to take an action, or maybe we can raise an alert that's going to trigger some form of automated remediation that can fix the issue. So let's have a quick look at CloudWatch as a service and how it actually works. So CloudWatch has multiple components to it. The number one component of CloudWatch is this right here. It's metrics, right? So that's the number one component that we want to be aware of. As I mentioned earlier, metrics gives us health and performance information of our AWS resources. So that's what metrics gives us. So that's the first component of CloudWatch. But there are two types of metrics that CloudWatch supports. CloudWatch supports standard metrics. And standard metrics, you can sort of define them as out-of-the-box metrics. These are metrics that are built in and provided by AWS themselves. So for example, what's the CPU utilization of our EC2 instances? What's the network utilization of our EC2 instances? What's the disk read and write operations for our EBS volumes, right? So what's the memory and disk activity for our Amazon RDS instances? All those are standard metrics. They are automatically collected. They are defined by AWS themselves. But we can also have custom metrics in CloudWatch. So custom metrics are metrics that we create ourselves. And how do we create those metrics? We can either create those metrics using the Amazon CLI. We can create them using CLI, or we can create them using the Amazon API. So we can use any of those to create our custom metrics in CloudWatch. And what this does is that it gives us the ability to build our own proactive alerting system using maybe custom script or from our own custom applications. The other component of CloudWatch that we need to know apart from metrics are the dashboards themselves, right? So the dashboards themselves, that's where we can get information or visualization of the metrics that we are collecting, and we can visualize them in CloudWatch. AWS supports two types of dashboards, two types of many things in AWS. So supports two types of dashboards. We can either have automatic dashboards, and as you can imagine, automatic dashboard means dashboard that comes out of the box. They are pre-built, they are managed by AWS, but we can also build our own custom dashboards, right? So we can get different metrics, put them together, visualize them, and essentially build our own custom dashboard from the metrics information that we're collecting. So the other thing to also be aware of is around something called the CloudWatch metrics math, right? So what does it mean? What do we mean when we say something like the CloudWatch metric math? What does that mean? So let me write that on the screen. So we have the metric math. So CloudWatch Metric Math is when we query information in CloudWatch Metrics, right? So we query that information and then we use different mathematical expressions to essentially analyze them. So we can use different mathematical expressions to analyze the metrics that we are collecting. And the result is that we have this new time series based data. We have this new time series based data that we can use maybe in terms of visualization, maybe in terms of some additional analysis that we need to do, right? There are multiple other components in terms of CloudWatch. So for example, CloudWatch can integrate with other AWS services like AWS SNS or even SQS. It can integrate with capabilities in AWS like auto-scaling, where we are looking at the metrics and we're defining and saying, if the metrics cross this threshold, I want to begin to use that to trigger auto-scaling. Remember that auto-scaling is not just an EC2 capability. There are multiple services in AWS that can auto-scale, including services like RDS, right? Okay, so let's move on. So, as mentioned earlier, Amazon CloudWatch monitors our AWS resources, collects all these standard or custom metrics that we've defined. And here is an example of how CloudWatch Alarm can work. So in this particular case, we've installed like the CloudWatch agent on an EC2 instance on AWS, and that allows communication between our EC2 instance and the CloudWatch service. And in this case, we're defining alarms in CloudWatch, and the alarms that we are defining in CloudWatch defines the threshold that we want to monitor for. In this case, if the CPU utilization of our EC2 instance, if it crosses certain threshold, we want to take a notification action. In this case, we integrate that with Amazon SNS to send an email to an administrator whenever that gets crossed, whenever the thresholds get exceeded. So that's just a quick example of that. So another service that we need to be aware of, at least for the purpose of the exam, till the exams are updated, is a service called CloudWatch Events. It's a service called CloudWatch Events. So this is not just CloudWatch, this is CloudWatch Events. So this is another service. Now, one thing to just warn you about is in the real world, AWS does not recommend using this service for managing events anymore. AWS recommends using a newer service called EventBridge to manage events, not CloudWatch Events anymore. So just keep that in mind. But for the purpose of the exam, before the exams are updated, you still need to just understand CloudWatch Events and just know what it is and what it does. So essentially, when you think about EventBridge, think of EventBridge as an updated version of CloudWatch Events. So this is a newer version. So EventBridge actually, if you look at documentation, it actually uses the same underlying service and the same underlying API that CloudWatch Event uses. So essentially, it's a similar service, but it provides newer and better way to manage our events. So let's talk about CloudWatch Event itself, not EventBridge this time. So I just wanted to put that in there so you're aware of what is going on. So CloudWatch Event. This is a service that we can use to track and respond to changes in AWS resources. So that is what this service exists for. Track and respond to changes in AWS resources. In AWS resources. And again, you can use EventBridge to do the same thing. There are three components that makes up CloudWatch Events. Number one, we have the events. These are the actual change notification that we want to respond to. So that's what are called events. So events are going to be coming from different event sources. And the different event sources will probably be services, AWS resources, sorry. Will probably be AWS resources. Those are the sources of the events that CloudWatch Events manage. So events can be, for example, an S3 bucket was created or an S3 bucket was deleted. An EC2 instance was started. An EC2 instance was stopped. A new message arrived in an Amazon SQL queue. A new log entry was written to CloudTrail. So it can be any sort of change notifications that come in from AWS resources. And actually, events can even come from custom applications that we've written. So we can write custom applications and then use the SDK to send events into CloudWatch event. Then after event, we have rules. Rules are used for two main things in CloudWatch event. They're used for filtering and they're used for routing. So that's what these are used for. So they're used for filtering and they're used for routing. What does it mean by filtering and routing? Filtering is where we are selecting the events that we're interested in processing. So we're not interested in all these events coming in. We're only interested in any event that matches this particular category, right? So we can define those filtering using rules in CloudWatch events. But we can also define routing in CloudWatch events. Routing is where we define the destination that we want to send the event to, maybe for further processing. So we define those using rules in CloudWatch events. And then finally, we have our targets. And the targets, these are the event handlers. These are the services that will be processing the events that are coming from the event sources. So these are event handlers. And that can be an EC2 instance. It can be a Lambda function. It can be Kinesis streams where we're streaming that maybe into another service. It can be an SNS topic where we're sending notification. It can be an SQS queue. It can be multiple other services in AWS, right? So that's sort of like how CloudWatch events work. So let's have a quick look at the CloudWatch event example. So in this particular example, we have an AWS Lambda function that logs changes in state for an Amazon EC2 instance. So in this case, what we've done here is we have a CloudWatch event rule that we've defined. And the CloudWatch event rule, what we've done is we've selected the events that we're interested in, which is whenever a new EC2 instance is launched. And then we've also defined the target for where to send that event to. In this case, the target is an AWS Lambda function. And the AWS Lambda function just does one thing, it's just logging that information maybe into a custom service, or a custom application that we have. So here's an example of CloudWatch events in practice. Any questions at all before I quickly move on to the next one? I hope it's making sense what we're discussing. Any questions at all, Sir Chigo? Oh, I think Sir Chigo may be in the background. Any questions at all, sir?
No question yet.
Okay.
Proceed.
Okay, yeah, let's proceed then. Okay, so let's have a look at another service here. So looking at the time. So we have AWS Config is another service. So let's look at AWS Config very quickly. What is AWS Config about? AWS Config is about monitoring for configuration changes. It's what this service is about. We want to monitor for configuration changes. Right? So we want to record whenever configuration change, and we want to be able to track the history of how configuration has changed over time. How has configuration changed in our AWS account in the last 1 month? How has configuration changed for this AWS resource in the last 1 month? So that is what AWS Config tells us. Keep in mind, for the sake of the exam, AWS Config doesn't tell us who made the change. It does not tell us who made the change. Right? So you want to find out who made the change. You're going to see that information in another service, which is CloudTrail, which we'll talk about maybe later in the series. However, it just tells us about the changes that's happened over time. So, and we can use those changes for different use cases, right? We can use the changes to investigate, maybe for just investigative purposes. We need to understand whether something has changed or not. We can use it for forensic purposes. So for example, maybe somebody's identity was compromised. You want to see what changes were made in your environment since you detected that the identity was compromised. AWS Config is a good place to do that. Another use case for this is we want to do compliance monitoring. We want to monitor our AWS services. We want to validate them or evaluate them against regulatory standards, like maybe PCI DSS and some other regulatory standards like SOC. So AWS Config can also be helpful with that. And then we want to maybe proactively send notifications if our resources violate certain compliance rules that we've defined. We can also use AWS Config for that. Another great thing about AWS Config is that it supports multi-region and multi-account use cases. Because what usually happens is when you start using AWS and the more you use AWS, you realize that the scale of things can be difficult to manage. So being able to manage things from a multi-region, multi-account perspective for certain services can make your lives easier. So AWS Config, it has integration with AWS organization, and then we can do that. So for example, in this particular case, we can aggregate AWS config data from multiple AWS accounts and from multiple AWS regions. We aggregate all those data, and that allows us to be able to do things like centralized auditing, centralized reporting. So we can do the reporting from one place. We can do the auditing from one place also, right? So it allows us to be able to do that. It just makes things easier for us. So AWS Config, it allows us to answer the following question, right? So number one question, is everything safe? So it can retrieve the configuration of our AWS resources, and we can use that to check our resources, are they configured securely in a safe way, right? So it does that by retrieving the configuration and letting us know whether they violate some policies that we've configured. It can help us to answer the question, what has changed? As I mentioned earlier, this can be useful for forensic investigation in our environment in the case of a breach, right? So the way that it can help us is we can look at historical configuration information, and then we can also set up like change notifications in our environment. What else can it help us to do? It can help us to understand what will this change affect? Because sometimes what happens is we're making changes to one resource. We're making changes to resource A. However, what we may not know is that the change that we're making to resource A has an impact on resource B, because they are either attached to each other or they are associated with each other. So it allows us to be able to view relationships between AWS resources. So for example, maybe you have an Amazon EBS volume that's attached to an EC2 instance. So maybe you're about to make certain changes to the EBS volume. This can help you to understand the relationship and help you to understand that actually this volume is associated with that EC2 instance. So speaking of item relationship, so again, when we use multiple AWS resources that depend on each other, if we make a change in one resource, it can have unintended consequences in another resource. So what AWS Config does, it allows us to view resources, and it allows us to view the relationships of the resources, right? So what else can it help us? It can help us to also identify very quickly what resources exist in our AWS account. So the way that it does that is it takes a regular snapshot of the current AWS configuration for resources in our AWS account. So, and just to mention this very quickly, AWS Config does not support every AWS resource. The last time I checked, it has support for 51 AWS resource types. So just keep that in mind. So this is not a service that's supported for every resource. So you won't be able to track configuration information for every single resource. It only supports 51 resource types the last time I checked. But as I mentioned, what it's going to be doing is that it's going to be taking configuration snapshot of what's going on in our environment. So it's going to take configuration snapshot for each resource that it supports. So in this case, it's taking a configuration snapshot for an EC2 instance. That configuration snapshot is referred to as a configuration item. What I'm saying is that is a point in time point-in-time configuration for a single resource. But what it's now going to do is that it's going to collect all those point-in-time configuration for all these other resources. It's going to collect them into a configuration snapshot, which is something on an account level. So we can go say, show me the snapshot of my configuration for my account at 10 p.m. yesterday. And you'll be able to see like what the configuration looks like for all the resources that it supports at 10 p.m. yesterday. So that's called a configuration snapshot. Configuration item is referring to a single resource. But how does config do what it does? Config does what it does using config rules. So what are AWS config rules? AWS config rules are policies that we can compare our resources against. So these are policies that we can compare our resources with. Right? Resources, if I can spell that correctly. So AWS config supports two types of config rules. It supports managed config rules. So managed rules are rules that are defined by AWS themselves, right? And because they are defined by AWS, it means they are easy to use, right? Easy to use because we have very little to configure because AWS already configured them. How many managed rules currently exist in AWS config? AWS currently has about 301 rules in AWS config. The last time I checked, they have about 301 rules. And that includes rules like check if my EBS volumes are encrypted. Check if my EC2 instances, if they belong to a VPC. Check if SSH is blocked in my security groups. Check if CloudTrail login, if it's enabled. So all of those exist as managed rules in AWS. But apart from managed rules, we also have custom rules. So custom rules is rules that we create by ourselves. So maybe you have a specific use case that you want to check your AWS resources against. You can define those as custom rules. But this is a little bit complicated. I personally am not a big fan of how this is implemented. I don't like the complication behind it because you have to implement that using a Lambda function, right? You have to implement that using a Lambda function. So what you want to assess, you have to define that in the context of a Lambda function, and then that Lambda function will be invoked to assess your resources, right? So you have to be responsible for maintaining that going forward. So that's a bit of an overhead that I'm not a fan of, right? So, and the good thing is that if whether it's managed rule or custom rules, if your resources, if when they are evaluated, they are found to be non-compliant, an alert can be sent or a resource violation can be raised. So to see the result of our config rules that we've defined, whether managed rules or custom rules, we can use the resource inventory interface in the AWS console. So this allows us to see a few things. It allows us to see the resource type. And then we have a list of the different resource types. And we can expand this. If we expand that, it's going to show us why the resources that exist for that resource type. And it's also going to show us the compliance information of those resources. Is it compliant? Is it not compliant? Why is it compliant? Why is it not compliant? But we also have this very interesting one called config timeline. So if you want to get a historical information of the configuration of the resources, you can use the config timeline and you can use that to get that historical information. And maybe you've identified a non-compliant resource and you need to make a configuration change. You can just go to manage resource. You click on the link to manage the resource and it takes you straight to the resource in the AWS console so you can make any changes that you need to make. So that's what that sort of like looks like. Okay, so let's move on very quickly. So another good thing that AWS Config supports is something called Conformance Packs. So Conformance Packs, essentially, it allows us to scale. That is what this is about. So it's about managing the compliance of AWS resources at scale. So Conformance Pack is an AWS Config feature where it integrates with AWS organization. So the idea behind that is we create a conformance pack. We define that as a YAML template. So we have a YAML template, and the YAML template is our conformance pack. And in the YAML template, we define two things. We define the rules that we want to access. So what are the config rules that we want to access? But then we can also define the remediation action to take. So remediation action to take if a resource is found to be non-compliant. And then we can take this template or this conformance pack with the rules and the remediation action. We apply that to our AWS organization. And then whenever resources are created across, maybe hundreds of accounts that we're managing, if the resource is created, it assessed against this compliance rules or this config rules. If they are found to fail, a remediation action automatically kicks in. So, and it supports both managed and it supports custom rules also. So very quickly, 1 minute. So I just found out I need to log into Kahoot for the other one. So let me also make sure I log into Kahoot. Okay, let me just quickly talk about a few more. I think I'll pause very soon. 1 minute. Okay, I think I'll what's the name? I think I'll conclude very soon so that we can have some time to do the quiz, and then we can sort of like pick that up at some point. Okay, so let's see. So here's a use case for AWS Config. So in this sample use case, we're looking at when a new S3 bucket is created, and the S3 bucket is created without being properly tagged. So if it's created without being properly tagged, what we can do is we have config that's going to, we've defined the rule that's going to evaluate every S3 bucket that's created. It's going to evaluate the S3 bucket, and if it violates the config rule, it's going to use SNS to send an email notification. But at the same time, we can also use config to go trigger or to go invoke a Lambda function. And that Lambda function config is going to supply the resource information that violated that policy or that rule. It's going to supply that information to the Lambda function, and then the Lambda function can automatically tag that resource. So here's an example of how that can flow together. I think I only have a few more minutes that I can talk about like a few more things. So, okay, let me move on very quickly. So Amazon MaySee, and I think I'll pause here for now, so apologies. So Amazon MaySee, so this is about data protection with machine learning, right? So we have data in our S3 bucket. We want to automatically discover the data that we have in our S3 bucket, identify sensitive data in our S3 bucket, classify them. Maybe we're looking for sensitive data like personal identifiable information, PIIs, financial information, encryption keys that are stored in S3 buckets, credential information that are stored in S3 buckets. But the good thing about it is we can even define custom data types to look at. So we can use regex, and we can use regex to define a pattern to say, if you find any data that has this pattern in my S3 bucket, notify me or take certain action. So it has that. It can integrate with AWS organization, so we can use it to manage manage compliance of our data at scale by integrating it with AWS organizations. So at the moment, I believe that there's a limit. So I could be wrong on this. I need to check the latest information. I believe that there's a limit of, I think, 5,000 accounts, 5,000 AWS accounts that we can essentially use for a single organization. So in terms of integrating with MaySee. So just keep that in mind. So the other thing about MaySee is that whenever it detects maybe a data leak risk, it's going to generate an alert, and we can get information about the alert from the AWS console. And actually, we can just make API calls to the MaySee API to also get those information back. So MaySee is going to look at S3 bucket. So it only currently supports just S3 bucket. It's going to look at that S3 bucket and it's going to scan for policy violations. It's going to scan for sensitive data. So for example, it's going to be scanning for policy violations like are the bucket public? Are they not encrypted? Maybe we've not enabled, by the way, encryption is not enabled by default for S3 buckets now. So buckets that are shared or replicated. So it's going to look at all of those, right? And then it's going to provide the information to us on the summary page. So it's going to provide the information about the public status of the bucket in our AWS account, the encryption situation of the bucket in our AWS account, and whether they're shared or replicated outside of our account. So it's going to provide those information to us on the summary page. But then we can drill down into the actual findings. And what MaySee is going to do is that it's going to consolidate the finding because there could be a lot of information. So it's going to consolidate those findings by bucket. So, and then it's also going to give us a priority of the type of alert that it's raising. So whether it's considered that to be high priority or maybe medium priority or low priority. So a few things to keep in mind when it comes to Amazon MaySee. How long does it store this information for? It stores this information for 30 days. So the information is stored in MaySee for 30 days. So we can go to the console and we can review this information. So I don't have time to get into login today, but we'll come back to login at some other time, or maybe I'll blog about it. So in the login, I wanted to talk about CloudWatch logs, S3 access logs, Elastic Load Balancer logs. So I wanted to talk about this, but we don't have enough time, so I'll stop there for now. Sarah Chugo, let's take any questions that we have, and let's see if we can address some questions before we go for the quiz.
Okay, perfect. One of the questions from Raymond, he says, what's the difference between CloudWatch, Event Bridge, and also can SNS replace Event Bridge?
Oh, okay. So good question. So
That's a double one.
Yeah, no, so it's a very good question. So to sort of like simplify that, right? So event bridge is meant to be about events, right? Event is about change notifications, right? And in order to understand that, notifications, you have to understand the difference between events and messages, because sometimes we think they're the same thing, but they're actually not the same thing. With events, again, we're really talking about change notification. So for example, I shout out to, or I just say out to my wife and I'm like, darling, I have the cup here, right? That's a notification, right? I may not expect her to do anything based on that. I'm just giving her information about something that happened. Whereas a message is usually talking about raw data. So when you're talking about messages on AWS, you're really talking about SQS and SNS, and you're talking about those services. But when you're talking about events, which are just lightweight change notifications, you're usually looking at services like Event Bridge and services like CloudWatch Event. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. So essentially, one is for events, the other is for messages.
So basically, you're trying to say that for events, notification is just, it doesn't require a response.
Yeah.
Kind of a key differentials then.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't require like, and I like the way you said that. So it doesn't require like, it doesn't have like a relationship where it's going, I'm expecting, a response in this format or anything. Yeah.
Okay, cool, perfect. So the next question is, what is the key difference between CloudTrail and CloudWatch logs?
So I'll say to that, CloudTrail, remember that is about it's logging information about AWS APIs, right? It's logging requests to AWS APIs, right? Not logs from your own custom applications. So if you want to be able to collect logs from your own custom applications, for example, you need to use a service like CloudWatch Logs to do that, right? Whereas CloudTrail is just a service that automatically logs requests to AWS APIs. I hope that explains what I'm talking about. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were saying, Adeyanju says, I think mostly Event Bridge can be used in conjunction with SNS, not a replacement.
Yeah, it's not a replacement for sure. So they do different things. So they can definitely be used in conjunction with each other. So, but again, sometimes it all depends on people's architecture, Satrigo, at least from
Yeah,
what I've
yeah,
seen. So, because sometimes, like I've seen people treat what you consider to be events and treat them like a message, right?
yeah,
And they process them like as if they're processing messages, maybe
yeah,
because of the way their application works, right?
yeah,
So sometimes it's about looking at exactly what exactly is the application doing, and if the application is just lightweight notification, especially Event Bridge has native integration with multiple AWS services, right?
mhm,
So you don't have to go and be saying, you can just plug into native AWS services like CloudTrail and S3 and all the others and say, if this event happens here,
mhm.
send it to that Lambda function to do processing, right? You don't have to do any additional configuration for that, right?
Yeah, perfect. Then another question from Harish. It says, does CloudWatch logs automatically backed up and stored in S3 without any manual configuration?
No, it's not automatically. Oh, okay. So talking about like the CloudWatch log group. So if you want to be able to keep them for longer, the recommendation is to put them in an S3 bucket and to store them in an S3 bucket. But you can also increase the time that that the logs are stored in the CloudWatch log group. So let me see, what's the limit of CloudWatch log group? Let me quickly have a look at the retention. So let's see. Okay, so the logs are not backed up, but you can actually keep the logs in CloudWatch log group indefinitely, right? You can keep them indefinitely, and you can choose a retention period between 1 day and 10 years. So actually, you can keep them for a very long time. So they're not automatic, but you can keep them for a very long time. However, so let's see, if you want to maybe do additional processing, maybe with another service, right? So you may probably be maybe a good example. Let's say you want to use a service like Athena to maybe query those logs. Then you may
Yeah,
need to put them in the S3 bucket first, right? But actually, you can keep those logs in CloudWatch log group for a very long time. Also, one of the things to also consider, Avish, I think, is the cost. Because I think CloudWatch logs, and I need to verify, but CloudWatch logs are more expensive than S3. So you may want to have a very detailed strategy of maybe you keep the logs for a few time in CloudWatch logs because you have those analysis built into that. And then you've got S3 bucket where you can move them into maybe for longer term and cheaper storage. So I think you may need to look at a mixture of multiple strategies there. Does that make sense?
yes, yeah. Okay, another question just came in now. Is CloudWatch Log Group a storage unit for the CloudWatch logs?
Yeah, so it is. It is. So if for storing CloudWatch logs, so the logs that you're putting in, so essentially you can have like it's like what the name says, it's a log group. So you can have a
Yes.
log group, which is like a simple, it's not like a bucket, but let's say it's a simple like repository for certain logs that you're collecting and you're putting in that log group.
Yeah. And one more question.
Okay,
Can you
sir.
not stream the logs directly for analysis?
Can you not stream the logs directly? So I'm trying to understand what that question means, Adewoye. So if you're saying if you're sending the logs into something like CloudWatch logs. CloudWatch logs, you can do certain levels of analysis directly, right, in CloudWatch logs. So, but however, you may want to do maybe some much more detailed analysis. Maybe you want to query it using some type of like some type of analysis query language. Then that can be, it can be useful to maybe stream them into another service, maybe to correlate with multiple other metrics and events that you're collecting, or maybe even for security use cases, right? Maybe you're streaming them into a service like Splunk, or some other service like Prisma Cloud, maybe for security analysis. Hey, so I'm looking at the time now because I think we want to get to the quiz. Because oh, sorry, sir. Please go ahead, sir.
Definitely, yeah. So I think let's quickly go to the quiz to save time. We don't have.
So we have it. Yes, sir. Okay. So let me go ahead and bring up like. Oh no! What happened? Okay. What happened? 1 minute. 1 minute. 1 minute. So I have my quiz. However, I cannot find my quiz. Oh, that's not good. Okay, let's try this again. So I created a quiz earlier, but I can't find it now. It's just not showing up. So I hope that there's nothing crazy going on. So let's see. Draft. Okay. It's in draft for some reason. Okay. I found it. So that's good. So don't worry. So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to the quiz now. Oh no. Oh no. This is not good. Oh, why is he doing this? It came up empty and then he was like loading the questions one by one. Okay, good. We're in business, ladies and gentlemen. So the winner of this quiz is going to be receiving an Amazon credit voucher. So for those that won the prizes yesterday and last week, your voucher codes have been sent by AWS and the voucher codes are already in our inbox. We're going to be dispatching them to you between today and tomorrow. But we're going to have one new winner today. So let's go ahead and kickstart. So first of all, if you go to www.kahoot.it, www.kahoot.it, so go over to that link and we have 5 questions today and we're going to have a winner. So just keep in mind the rule. If you've won a gift in this series, you can still participate in the quiz. However, you cannot win our prizes twice in this series. We're going to have other series that you can win the prizes, but in this series, we want to make sure that we distribute the prizes to as much people. So you can only win the prizes once. So the prize once. Okay, so the PIN number is 4708262. That is the PIN number. So let me bring this up on the screen. So let's go ahead and share my screen again. Let's do that. Where is there we go. Okay, I can see that we've got like a lot of people. And awesome. We've got 5 questions for you. 5 questions. We're just going to give it a few more seconds and then we'll start. So again, if you're looking to join, www.kahoot.it and put in the PIN number 4708262. If you've won the prize before, you can participate, but you cannot win twice. So you only be a participator. Okay, let's go ahead and get started because of time. So let's get started. So first question for today. Oh, multiple select. You need to ensure that logs for an EC2 instance is stored securely with limited access. What 2 steps should you do? Logs from an EC2 instance. And actually, this is a very interesting one, Satrigo, because this is one of the questions that was asked earlier by someone. The difference between
Yeah.
CloudTrail and
Yes.
CloudWatch.
Let's see if somebody's paying attention.
Yeah. So you have to select 2 steps. Oh, no one is answering yet? Okay, we have got 1 answer. Got 2 answers now. Okay, let's see. So I think only maybe about 4 people got this correctly. So, but we'll see. So we got both of them correctly. So number 1, we cannot send EC2 instance logs to CloudTrail. CloudTrail is for AWS Service API logs. So that takes that out of the picture. So that also takes the second one out. So we use a CloudWatch Log Group, and then we can install the CloudWatch agent to send the logs to a CloudWatch Log Group, and then we can create an IAM policy to give the access that we want to the users. So let's see what the scoreboard looks like. And we have Joshi leading. Well done. So next question. You have enabled CloudTrail logs for an AWS account. The logs need to be encrypted at rest. What should you do? Oh, by the way, I think I need to change the way that our images are displayed because we're blocking the answer. Apologies. I've just cleared that up, Jima. Apologies. Yeah, I've done that. Adequately sorry about that. Apologies. So let's see if you understand encryption at rest in AWS. Okay, let's see. So, oh no! No one got this correctly because everyone thought you need to do something. But in CloudTrail, the logs are encrypted at rest. It's not like your S3 is, there's also encryption at rest that's been enabled for S3 recently. However, in the past, you needed to go to enable that by yourself. But so you do nothing is the answer to this. So let's see what the scoreboard looks like. No change. So let's see. Question number 3. You need to implement a config rule to perform a custom check on resources in certain AZs. What should you do? Okay, let's see that. Whoa, only one person got this correctly. So, and actually, this is one that we actually covered in class today. So we covered this in class today. So if you're using AWS Config, you can use managed rules, which are rules created by AWS So which are rules created by AWS, or we can use custom rules. So, and if we're using, and if we're using custom rules, we do that using a Lambda function. So only one person got that correctly. Let's see what the scoreboard looks like. Any changes? Oh, we have Moderator now number 1 on the list. So there's still two more questions. So let's see. Number 4, you want to track access requests for an S3 bucket. What is the easiest way to achieve this? Whenever a request comes to an S3 bucket, you want to track that. What's the easiest way to achieve this? So 3 people got that correctly. So we didn't get to this today, but maybe we'll get to it in another session. So if you want to track access requests for an S3 bucket, you need to enable server access login for the bucket. So that's how you track that. So not using CloudWatch logs. If you use, you need logs themselves, so you need to enable the logs. So let's see what the scoreboard looks like. Oh, we have Samco now leading. Oh, and final question to determine the winner for today's credit voucher is a multi-select question. Your manager has asked how AWS Config custom rules check can be triggered for a S3 bucket. Which answers are correct? I'll give you a hint. There are 2 correct answers. There are 2 correct answers. You need to... How do you trigger, how are the custom rule checks triggered for AWS Config? That's the question. There are 2 answers here. And let's see. And 6 people got the first one correctly, which is AWS config rules for the custom rules. Whenever there is a change in configuration, it's going to assess that resource. And also, periodically, we can also configure and say periodically, every 1 hour, assess the configuration of my resources. So those are the 2 times that AWS config custom rules are triggered. So let's see what our winner is for today, Sir Chugo.
Yes.
And Avish is asking for my social media account, so let me share that. So my name is David Okeyode. So for Sir Chugo, if you just Google Sir Chugo, just Google Sir Chugo, you're going to see his name. Or just search for the money man, or the investor. Is the real investor, Sir Chugo. So let us see what the scoreboard looks like. So on the podium, number 3, we have Sal. Well done, Sal. Well done. And number 2, we have Mulero. Well done, Mulero. And number 1, we have Samco. Well done, Samco. Well done, well done, well done. Congratulations to you. Congrats, Samco. So what you need to do, Samco, is you send us your full name and your email address. So your full name, you need to send it to this email, Samco. So I put an email in the chat window, AWS West Africa at outlook.com. So send your full name and your email us, and we'll get your voucher to you. So if you've won it before, we're not going to be sending it to you. We're going to pick Mulero, who is the second person. So anyways. Okay, so thanks very much for joining us. Sir Chugo, anything that we want to say to round up for today?
Yes, quite an interesting section today. Really enjoyed it. I learned a lot about AWS logs. Yeah, one more thing about the winners today. So it's quite interesting section we had. And so I'm looking forward for next week. We have another section next week on the 24th. And I believe you guys can join us. It's quite an interesting topic as well. That will be managing secrets on AWS. So David Okeyode will be the speaker. And likewise, I'll be the moderator. So, gentlemen, it's a pleasure. David, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Not at all, sir. So again, well done, sir. So thanks very much for moderating, and we'll see the audience next week. So have a lovely rest of the day, everyone. Morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're joining us from, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Definitely. Bye, guys. Good evening. Bye.